So we're here to learn about 2 Kings chapter 11 and 12 today in Watershed. All right. So in this particular slide, what we see is a pictorial of what happened for the people of God in a historical framework. And so we can get really entranced by a lot of the details here. But we don't want to miss that big picture that I was just talking about. The overarching picture is, what is God doing here? And how does this slide of long stretch of history, how does that fit into an even longer stretch of history that we're part of? Okay? So that's what we're going to try to do today. But I do want you to notice that there's a split there after Solomon. Okay? Because I'm going to touch on this with Jeroboam and Rehoboam, the northern tribes and the southern tribes. But I also want you to notice the arrows at the far right side of the screen and notice what happened. Here are people who are up and down, in and out of their journey with God and their faithfulness to God. But at this point in time, there was judgment, divine judgment on an entire large group of people, nation of Israel, okay? But that's not the end of the story. Okay, so we have to come back to some things here in a little bit. I also was very interested as I looked at 1st and 2nd Kings. In the original Hebrew Bible, the 1st and 2nd Kings is one book, so it's just the book of Kings. But you'll notice that sometimes in our categorizing of books of the Bible, we'll say, well, that's the Gospels, and that's historical narrative, and that's apocalyptic literature. You know, we have these buckets that we kind of lump books of the Bible into. But do you know, in the original Hebrew Bible, the book of Kings is in the prophets. Okay, so there's almost a sense in which I want to not look at the chapter headings. I want to not look at the division of chapter and verse. I want to look at the whole scripture and kind of see it holistically, and not with presuppositions about what everything is. Like, I don't want to be told exactly what every section means. I want to read the text and see what the text supplies as far as the meaning. And so the fact that the Old Testament folks who, by the inspiration of God, wrote this Hebrew scripture, they placed Kings along with the prophetic writings. And I'm like, why would they do that? Why would they do that? What's prophetic about Kings? I thought it was historical narrative. We're going to come back to that, okay? So let me read a few verses here, because we're going to jump into 1 Kings chapter 11. And just for fun, I looked at some of the names. There are a lot of names. It can get really confusing really fast because there's so many names and so much interaction of the characters in the narrative. So I put the bad people in red. I used a green font for good people in the stories. And then the blue is kind of wishy-washy. Okay, that's kind of in the middle. So let me read this, and then I'll unpack some of it with you. When Athaliah, Ahaziah's mother, saw that her son was dead, she proceeded to annihilate all the royal heirs.
That's pretty bad.
Yeah. Doesn't that just, how's that for a start, the first sentence? Yehosheba, who was King Jehoram's daughter and Ahaziah's sister, secretly rescued Joash, son of Ahaziah, from among the king's sons who were being killed, and put him and the one who nursed him in a bedroom. So he was hidden from Athaliah and was not killed. Joash was in hiding with her in the Lord's temple 6 years, while Athaliah reigned over the land. So I thought, first of all, who are the bad people? Who are the good people? Who are the wishy-washy people? How do they fit into this story? Who are the characters that we've already been introduced to? So I kind of found and manipulated a little bit, kind of added to, I should say, not manipulated, but added to. This is part of a family tree for the characters in the Bible. The ones that are on the left in the blue line is the line of Judah. The ones on the right in the gold line are the line of Israel. Okay? Now, the line of Judah is what is often referred to as the line of promise. That means that when God decided that he was going to call out a people through Abraham, they were going to bless the whole earth, that they were going to call people to true worship of the true God, that then led to David, it led to Solomon, and it flows on down the line. So you have this succession of rulers who are also supposed to be helping bring the people back to true worship of the true God. And that same line keeps going through history well beyond a Watershed section today, thousands of years to Jesus. The line of promise, that's where it goes. The other one's not the line of promise, and there are good reasons for it. But you'll find, maybe you'll find this as interesting as I did, that Ahaziah in our narrative here, who came in to annihilate all the royal heirs, she married into the line of promise. She married the guy named Jehoram. See, they're side by side there. But look who Mama and Daddy are. Athaliah's mom and dad are Ahab and Jezebel. They grew up as Baal worshipers, okay? They grew up not worshiping Yahweh, the true God. And one thing I really want to make clear is that when we say false gods, we use that terminology, right? It doesn't mean that they're fake or that they're not there. It means that they are there, but they're leading people into false worship, or that they are the objects of false worship. The gods of the Bible, when we read the ancient Near Eastern texts and the biblical accounts of people worshiping other gods, and there are many of them that are geographically connected, are real gods. They are real spiritual beings that people are worshiping instead of Yahweh, the true God, the creator God, who's sovereign over everything. Okay, so these are not pretend worshipings. These are real worshipings that people are involved in. So anyway, without going into too much detail, what we could say is Athaliah corrupted the line of Judah. She was the one and only and preeminent Baal worshiper in the whole line of promise. She married into it. One other thing I'd like to point out to you is it's talking about Joash there, you see, who's the son of Ahaziah. They protected Joash for 6 years while Athaliah killed off everybody else who would have been the king in the line of promise. She usurped it. She came in and took it by force because she was married to Jehoram, and it says that Joash was tucked away with the one who nursed him. And I don't know if that is his mom, who we find out in another passage, her name is Zibiah, or if it was actually a nursemaid. Joash's father was gone. He was killed in battle at the age of 22. So Ahaziah had married Zibiah and had Joash as a son. Later on, though, Athaliah marries into the family, and Ahaziah is not around anywhere, and so she just kind of takes over. So I'm going to quickly read through a few more verses here because now the story continues. In the 7th year, so it's 6 years that little Joash boy had been hidden away, okay? Keep him safe because he's in the line of promise. In the 7th year, Jehoiada, who's a priest of Yahweh, keep that in mind, he's a good guy, green. Good guy. He sent for the commanders of hundreds, the Karites, and the guards, three groups of military people. He had them come in to him in the Lord's temple where he made a covenant with them, put them under oath. He showed them the king's son, little Joash, and commanded them, this is what you're to do. A third of you who come on duty on the Sabbath are to provide protection for the king's palace. A third are to be at the foundation gate, and a third at the gate behind the guards. You're to take turns providing protection for the palace. Your 2 divisions that go off duty on the Sabbath are to provide the king protection at the Lord's temple. Protect Joash. completely surround the king with weapons in hand. Anyone who approaches the ranks is to be put to death. Be with the king in all his daily tasks. So the commanders of hundreds did everything the priest Jehoiada commanded. They each brought their men, those coming on duty on the Sabbath and those going off duty, and came to the priest Jehoiada. The priest gave to the commanders, now watch this text. The priest gave to the commanders of hundreds King David's spears and shields that were in the Lord's temple. Then the guards stood with their weapons in hand surrounding the king from the right side of the temple to the left side by the altar and by the temple. Jehoiada brought out the king's son, put the crown on him, gave him the testimony, and made him king. They anointed him and clapped their hands and cried, "Long live the king." Earlier in the verse, remember there were 3 military groups that were called out to help. One of them were the Karaites. So I thought, who are the Karaites? So I drilled down into the Karaites. That is a group of mercenary soldiers who King David, they were from the Negev desert, years before hired to help protect him from being chased around the Negev, and they were loyal to David. So 2 things were remaining from those days of trying to preserve the line of promise through David. One was the protectors who were militarily able to provide protection. These mercenaries, they were not Hebrew. They were not Israelites. They were outsiders, but loved David and wanted to support him. And that's one factor. And then the other was the very weaponry of David's weaponry was preserved in the palace. And that was used to overthrow Athaliah, this faker to the crown. So there he is. That's little Joash. He's 7. He's getting the crown put on his head. And you can see the soldiers and David carrying David's weaponry. Some of it is David's weaponry. And he's king now. Okay? So what about little old Athaliah, the Baal-worshiping faker? When Athaliah heard the noise from the guard and the crowd, she went out to the people at the Lord's temple. She looked, and there was the king, Joash, standing by the pillar according to the custom. The commanders and the trumpeters were by the king, and all the people of the land were rejoicing and blowing trumpets. And Athaliah tore her clothes and, how ironic, screamed, "Treason, treason." Can't you just feel the excitement and the drama here? And there are the trumpeters. I had to get one of the trumpeters. But I also thought this picture was interesting because instead of weapons, what are the people carrying here?
Palm branches.
Palm branches. Foreshadowing. Then the priest Jehoiada ordered the commanders of hundreds in charge of the army, take her out, Athaliah, between the ranks and put to death by the sword anyone who follows her. For the priest had said, she is not to be put to death in the Lord's temple. That would desecrate the temple of Yahweh. And they arrested her. She went through the horse entrance to the king's palace where she was put to death. Notice what it says here. Put her to death, and what else? Anyone who follows her. Eradicate the false worship. What does that sound like? When the people were first called into the land of promise, the geographical location, and you read this in Genesis 10, where God allocated to his people a certain place that would be for worship of him alone, and the nations worshiped other gods. So there's a connection here. Then Jehoiada made a covenant between the Lord, that's Yahweh. Anytime we see the Lord in the Old Testament, it's the name, personal name Yahweh is actually that. That's the tetragrammaton, the Hebrew up there, that's what that is. The king and the people, that they would be the Lord's people. And so you got a vertical covenant between the Lord and the people, renewed, and another covenant between the king and the people. You've got this cross, vertical and horizontal covenant making so that people would be brought back into right worship of the true God. And then what happened? All the people of the land went to the temple of Baal and tore it down. Now, I'm assuming, because this is in Jerusalem, when all this drama is taking place, and it says the people of the land went to the temple of Baal and tore it down, I'm assuming they had a temple of Baal built in or near Jerusalem. That's how bad Athaliah had forced this Baal worship on the people of God, is they brought it right into their area. And they smashed its altars and images to pieces, and they killed Matan, the priest of Baal, so he's the counterpart, he's the opposite of Jehoiada, at the altars. So then Jehoiada appointed the guards for the Lord's temple. He took the commanders, the Karites, there are mercenary guys, the guards and all the people of the land, and they brought the king from the Lord's temple. They entered the king's palace where he's going to live by way of the guard's gate, and he sat on the throne of the kings. He went from a back room, hidden away, little private chamber, to being on the throne in the palace. There's an emergence of royalty. And all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet, for they had put Athaliah to death by the sword in the king's palace. And that's a depiction of Joash as an older guy. He reigned for 40 years. And the scripture says that he was good sometimes and he wasn't good sometimes. He was kind of wishy-washy. That's why I had him wishy-washy colored. Okay. He did some good things, and there are two theories. One is that Jehoiada was constantly trying to coach and counsel and direct Joash as he grew up, because Jehoiada was this wise priest of Yahweh. And sometimes Joash would listen to him and sometimes he wouldn't. The other theory is that Jehoiada was very consistent and Joash listened to him until Jehoiada died, because he was an older fella. And then Joash kind of wandered, and did whatever he wanted to do. But one interesting thing is he did some good things, Joash did, such as repairing the temple of Yahweh. This is from scripture, which tells me that breaks my heart, because the temple of Yahweh had been being broken down and desecrated and not in good repair, while the temple of Baal is being built up in its place. I mean, what lesson is that for us in our lives and our culture? We were talking about culture earlier. So he even tried to get them to fix the temple. And you know what the priests did? They shuffled their feet and didn't do anything for 23 years. Now that tells me that you got some trouble in the priestly ranks too. Probably syncretism, but could be other things. And eventually they repaired it. It says, though, in 2 Kings chapter 12, throughout the time, the priest Jehoiada instructed him, Joash did what was right in the Lord's sight. I just mentioned that. And here's the problem, and it's in red because it's bad. Yet the high places were not taken away. The people continued sacrificing and burning incense on the high places. The high places are where out in the countryside, up mountaintops and things, hilltops, where they would have these worship services, because they believed the gods were close to the mountaintops. So you find temples on mountaintops, you find altars on mountaintops, you find worship services on the mountaintop, things like that. And they didn't eradicate it completely, so the people kept worshiping the false god. There's one more little part of the story I'll briefly mention. Later on, when Joash was ruling, there was a threat from an outside king who was he had conquered Gath. Remember Gath? You know what happened at Gath? David and Goliath happened in Gath. Goliath was a Gittite. And so this was an area over in the Philistine area. And this Hazael, who was an Aramean king, came to conquer that area and did conquer it. And the next thing in his sights was Jerusalem. And Joash says, "Whew, man, this guy's coming with the big army. He's going to conquer us. So what are we going to do?" Well, guess what he did? He took all of the consecrated items of his 3 generations back in the priestly line of promise, gave them, along with the things from the temple and the palace, all the gold and silver and stuff like that. He bought him off. He bribed him to keep him from conquering. And why would he do that? What a stupid thing to do. Well, here's why. Ahaziah had been killed by this Hazael. His daddy, he was an orphan because his father died in battle against the same general. And so he was made an orphan, and he saw the damage that this guy could do, and he's like, no, let's just. But that's just another story for another day. Guess what? Joash is not mentioned in the New Testament. He's not mentioned in the New Testament. Several kings are not mentioned. Ahaziah, Joash, and Amaziah, and Athaliah is not mentioned. So Matthew intentionally leaves out the bad portion that was affecting the line of promise for the sake of keeping the continuity there. And then that leads us right on into Jesus and how he fulfilled what God had in store for all of his people.